Hey, what up, everybody? It's Moss coming to you with another Pioneer review, or I guess just another set review. This time we're going to review Duskmourn in Pioneer, and just in case you guys didn't already know, right now as I'm recording this, it's like the week before Duskmourn releases officially in paper. Pre release was last weekend, and the week after this is the RC and DC. Pioneer RC, so this is definitely going to be a big set for everyone participating in it. So, if you want to see any more of my Pioneer insights before going into DC, maybe hearing about the deck that I'm running on Twitter, something like that, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, follow me online, follow me on Twitter, and well, let's go ahead and get this started. So, one of the first things that we need to talk about with Duskmourn is really just the cycle of lands that kind of emerged out of this set. The Verges as like the new dual lands of the set actually seem pretty sweet. That being said, they're not all created equally. So we got 5 rare lands in this cycle, and obviously we're going to get the others probably in the Death Race set in like 2025. But there are 3 out of the 5 here that actually stand out as being Pioneer playable, and that's the Gruul, the Azorius, and the Celestial ones. Out of the cycle, those 3 are probably going to be the ones that immediately slot into a lot of decks. Obviously, the Celestial one is going to be wanted in Angels. You're going to have the Azorius one showing up in Control, and you're going to see Thornspire showing up a lot in obviously the Gruul Aggro, Gruul Prowess lists. The ones that aren't going to make the cut, surprisingly, are going to be Blaze, Mire Verge, and Gloomlake Verge. Dimir as like a control deck isn't necessarily going to be super hot, especially in DC. Flood Farm, the Azorius one, is going to be a lot better just because the Azorius decks right now are really shifting their focus to being more exile based with the prominence of red black prowess that's showing up in the format. The reason why the red black land, the Rakdos land, isn't going to be heavily played in the Boros list, or rather in the Rakdos list, however, is simply because the deck leans really heavily on red and not necessarily on black as much. I think, and this is just based on what little playtesting I've done with a couple of the decks that I'm planning on taking into DC, there's maybe an argument that Thornspire could actually be run in the Rakdos Prowess list, just turning it into Jund. That way you could maybe get the green out of the sideboard so that you can have some protection spells for your own creatures in the mirror match. But Blazemire in just the straight up Rakdos Prowess list isn't great. You're going to need to have a mountain in order to turn it on, and the deck is only running 2 basic mountains, and it's running the 4 like shock lands, which, yeah, they're fine, but having to deal yourself any amount of damage is going to be pretty impactful. So I think we're going to see a lot of these in DC and not a whole lot down here. Moving on, obviously, with the bannings that came in the form of Sorin and Amalia, the deck that everyone was really expecting to pop back up and has popped back up is, unsurprisingly, Mono Green. Now, that being said, Mono Green has really kind of changed its focus to a certain extent. It's still doing the Nykthos, Cavalier, and Storm the Festival thing, but now it's also starting to do the big elk thing, the one that flips from the recent Innistrad set. It's doing the Uvenwald like beast that turns all of your stuff into like these bigger rampy creatures. It's basically doing a Craterhoof Behemoth thing. And that's really good. But I think the deck could potentially want Overlord of the Hauntwoods. Now it's got the Uvenwald Oddity 2 green pips, and yeah, it's competing for Cavalier of Thorns in the deck. But I think one of the things that's really going to work to the benefit of the mono green deck is the fact that the Overlord of the Hauntwoods ends up making this everywhere token land. Now, you might be thinking, well, it's mono green. Why would they need all of these other colors? And the thing is, it does open them up to a lot of potential bombs for either the mirror match or for other potential decks. This lets them run a lot of silver bullets in their sideboard. Right now, one of the things that we're seeing pop up a lot in Pioneer is this like Boros Control, Boros Transmogrify list that's running occasionally Possibility Storm, but definitely running the High Noons. Having an everywhere token that allows you to potentially bring in wear tears or even better, leyline binding out of the sideboard is gonna be huge to deal with something that is stopping you from just going off and casting a bunch of spells on your turn. And you do get this off of the Storm the Festival, which is pretty impactful. And not only does it do that when it enters the battlefield, but it also does it when it attacks. So you're getting a bunch of these lands that tap for all colors that are all types. That's huge. 1 mana leyline bindings, you get a lot of good stuff, and honestly, this may allow the deck to move away from running the Leyline of the Guild Pact, which, sure, it's good, but it's an enchantment that while it adds 4 green pips, past that, it's not really doing a whole lot, and it can be a liability, especially if you're seeing a lot of pick your poisons. This does allow you to work around it. You're going to have to play a little bit more of an honest game plan, but you get a lot more silver bullets that help you deal with things. Pair that with maybe even going back to the beginning of Pioneer version of Mono Green that was running the Vivian and like the creature sideboard package. And again, there's maybe something that could be done with this, but who's to say? And honestly, it works really well for all the mono green gamers that are starting to run the great Phyrexian, the mother of machines herself, Elish Norn, out of the sideboard. So this might be a good pickup. And unsurprisingly, Overlord of the Hauntwoods, the whole Overlord cycle, is going to show up a lot. Now, this Duskmourn set has been huge for enchantments. Alright, this is basically Theros but made scary. So, the Enigmatic Incarnation and Fires of Invention decks have really gotten a lot of tools that they can play with. Overlord of the Hauntwoods, again, incredible because it's making you those everywhere tokens that allow you to get 1 mana leyline bindings. But you also get a whole host of other Overlords in this set. I will admit, the green and the red Overlords definitely stand out as being the better of the two. Alright, Overlord of the Boiler Bilges is great because it lets you do the Inferno Titan thing when it enters and when it attacks. That's huge, and you can cast it for its impending cost, where it just enters as an enchantment and isn't a creature until that final thing. It's pretty good. Overlord, you can cast it for 1 and 2 green for its impending. You can basically play that on curve into Enigmatic and then hit this Overlord that can attack on turn 5. This is huge. Now, combine that with some of the other glimmers, the other enchantment creatures, Enduring Courage, Enduring Vitality, turn all of your creatures into mana dorks, make it so that your creatures get +2/+0 and haste, and when they die, when you sack them to Enigmatic, they just come back as regular enchantments with the effects still there, are great. So these are important things to think about. The other 3 Overlords in the cycle, again, they're kind of meh. The other one that you could maybe think about running is Overlord of the Mistmoors or even some of the Rooms, but as a whole, the Room cycle doesn't really feel constructed playable, which is so odd for me to even say. But Definitely be on the lookout for Enigmatic and look out for all of these enchantment creatures that are absolutely going to be helping the deck pop off. Combine that with fires and the fact that you get, again, a land token off of Overlord of the Hauntwoods, helping you ramp and cast your bigger stuff for free. It's gonna be nutty. Next up, we've got Abhorrent Oculus. Now, a lot of players were really comparing this to a combination of Murktide Regent and Monastery Mentor, and it definitely does feel good. But exiling 6 cards from your graveyard as an additional cost for this feels pretty terrible. However, we do have a little bit of standard tech that could be useful for us in Pioneer. Picklock Prankster alongside Helping Hand were two great cards alongside Haughty Djinn that really created this fantastic combo deck that let you get Haughty Djinn, Monastery Mentor, and a bunch of prowess tokens out on the battlefield. I think what we're going to be able to do now, though, in Pioneer, is throw a bunch of Abhorrent Oculuses into the graveyard, get a 5/5 flying beat stick that makes 2/2 zombies, or just 2/2 creatures, because manifesting dread. Alright, 2/2 creatures at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep. To a certain extent, that's kind of better than what you would see with the Monastery Mentor, where you have to cast the actual spells in order to get that effect. And let's say that Picklock Prankster isn't putting them into your yard. You do have Ledger Shredder. You're basically playing a blue-white version of the Phoenix game plan, albeit without the haste. But the recursion is there, and if that wasn't good enough, you can still run the Treasure Cruise, which managed to evade a ban this whole time. All without having to sacrifice the precious cards that you have in your graveyard. It's not growing bigger like Murktide would, but it's still putting an absolute clock on your opponents. So it's definitely worth keeping in mind. It might not be dominating tables in DC, but I guarantee you there may be someone else who's considering this exact same deck, backed up by a bunch of good counter spells, and maybe even the Wandering Emperor and Teferi to just further their game plan. Up next, we have the horror that was a couple of Pro Tours ago, Indomitable Creativity, Reanimator decks as a whole. This set has provided us with not only a couple good reanimation targets, but arguably the best reanimation spell in Pioneer in Rite of the Moth. We have finally gotten Unburial Rites in the format, which, good. Alright, 4 mana, white, 2 black, and 1 that reanimates a target creature from your graveyard with a finality counter, and it's got flashback for 6. That's not bad, especially when, with Indomitable Creativity, you're making a lot of tokens, you're potentially throwing a lot of stuff into your graveyard that could really make this useful. Like I said earlier, we're starting to see a red-white Indomitable Creativity deck pick up some steam. It's not hard to realistically see that deck getting some treasure tokens, maybe leaning into Mardu with some extra sacrifice synergies thrown in there. And it's got a new target in the form of Valgavoth Terror Eater. Alright, flying, lifelink, and an incredible ward of sacrificing 3 target non-land permanents. You're never casting this thing, but if it hits the battlefield off of Creativity or because of Rite of the Moth, it's basically game over. Alright, it's got this fantastic Layline of the Void effect right here, where if a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, it gets exiled. And you can cast those spells by paying life instead of their mana value. So all of your opponent's good things that go into the graveyard, now you can play them just by paying a little bit of life. It's kind of doing like a pseudo Gristlebrand thing, which kind of works out. That being said, you can still do a lot of the traditional Indomitable Creativity things. Atraxa, Vaultborn Tyrant, obviously the biggest two. But if Phoenix is going to be as problematic of a presence as people are expecting it to be, running a copy or two of Valgavoth, just like we see with modern Goryo's Vengeance running just one or two of Gristlebrand, might not be a bad idea. Definitely worth a huge consideration there. All right, past that, we got to talk about, obviously, some good red shenanigans. All right, Screaming Nemesis. During preview season, this was a card that me and my teammates were all over. All right, haste. If it deals damage, or rather if it's dealt damage, it gets to deal that much to any other target. All right, we're already looking at a Boros Reckoner effect. And then if it deals damage to a player this way, they can't gain life for the rest of the game. Now, initially, again, I was super hyped about it, but then I started thinking about that second line of text like, oh, well, it's going to be hard to have your opponent just block this when it comes down on turn 3 and swings at them. They're going to be hard pressed to block it. So, womp womp, not that great. However, started to think about it a little bit more. Started practicing a little bit with the Rakdos Prowess list, and I started thinking about how Reckless Rage is a card in that deck. And it deals 2 damage to any creature you control, and 4 damage to any creature an opponent controls. So Screaming Nemesis on 3. Swing in. They don't block. Reckless Rage at the beginning of turn 4. 2 to your thing, 4 to theirs. You take a creature off the board, throw an additional 2 damage at your opponent. And now they can't gain life for the rest of the game. With the resurgence of Angels that has started to come up in the last couple of weeks to deal with the Rakdos Prowess list, this seemed like a perfect addition to any sideboard that was really struggling with that matchup. Rampaging Ferocidon is a chef's kiss, but given the way that the metagame is shifting and given the way that really how Angels can deal with Rampaging Ferocidon by just slamming a Skyclave Apparition and dealing with it, maybe Screaming Nemesis and Reckless Rage are a better way to go. Sure, it's not dealing the damage immediately to your opponent, but you can do a lot with this. You can sacrifice your own creatures to burn together, target the Screaming Nemesis, deal that damage to your opponent after you target it and kill it. They can't gain life. You're hitting them for a bunch. There's no way that they can recover. All of this seems like an incredible way to deal with life gain that's showing up to really put a hamper on Rakdos, but also, consequently, Boros. This could be a good card in there. They were already playing Reckless Rage. Maybe this is just a natural addition for them. Who knows? And speaking of Callous Sellsword, let's talk about the Mind Skinner. Alright? It's a 3 blue pip 10-1 creature that cannot be blocked. If there was anything that seemed terrifying about this card, it's all this text right here. It can't be blocked. Its stats, horrifying. It's the second line that definitely makes the card seem less terrifying. Alright? Prevent damage. Opponent mills that many cards. Womp, womp. However, we can just say that damage can't be prevented. This combined with the Mind Skinner, Insult to Injury, a random bulk rare from Amonkhet, can turn this into a turn 4 lethal play. And really, that's kind of the place where Pioneer as a whole is right now. Turn 3, turn 4 with these Rakdos decks that are coming out of nowhere. Maybe it's time to see Izzet with a turn 4 combo win. Deal double damage, damage can't be prevented. This just turns immediately into a 2020 attacker on turn 4 that your opponents cannot deal with unless they have exactly removal. And it really, if you're doing this on turn 4 in Izzet, you've probably got a counterspell backing you up. This combined with a stubborn denial or a spell pierce is gonna go a long way. Or maybe you can even go weird and go Grixis with it. Run Callous Sellsword. Maybe you can be a very weird version of the Prowess deck and run this in there as just an extra beat stick. It's going to be hard to justify for the 3 blue pips, but hey, anything's possible. Alright, next on the list is Kona, Rescue Beasty. Now, again, people have been hyped about this card ever since it got spoiled, mostly because that survival ability turns Kona immediately into show and tell. If it makes it to the second main phase and it's tapped, you get to put any permanent from your hand onto the battlefield. Legacy players know all about the horror that is show and tell, putting in Emrakul, putting in Atraxa, putting in Ulamog, putting in any number of big, terrifying threats onto the battlefield. That being said, show and tell does it as like an enchantment. How are we going to get Kona tapped? And the answer is vehicles. The answer is have it mount something. There's a lot of ways that we can get Kona tapped, and then we can put in just the most obnoxious types of creatures onto the battlefield that our opponents are forced to answer. Already, we've seen the Sultai Neoform deck show up a little bit in Pioneer. Not as much as it used to before the Sorin banning, but definitely showing up in some amount if you've watched any of the videos on my channel recently. This card actually seems like a really good inclusion in that deck. If you can't get the Neoform combo itself to go off, Kona and just valuing a Smuggler's Copter, the Battle Bus, getting a Caustic Bronco out there, all of this seems really good. And really, Kona and a Caustic Bronco combined with any of these cards, doming your opponent for 7 or 10 or 13 damage and then slamming it on the battlefield is huge. It might not be the most competitive card, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. Next, as someone who is a big Convoke enjoyer, I have to bring up Arabella, the Jolly Balloon Man, and Clockwork Percussionist. These 3 cards are really making the Convoke player in me think about all the good things that this deck can do now. Alright, Jolly Balloon Man has tap, pay 1, and you can make a copy of any target creature you control. In the Convoke list, this isn't really hitting a whole lot of targets besides Imadane's Recruiter. Jolly Balloon Man definitely seems a little bit more like a commander card than anything else, but I do think that there are a couple of shells where you can make some really good value creatures here, and then just make them red balloons, immediately sacrifice them, and do a lot with them. But I think really for like Boros Convoke as a whole, the 2 biggest cards are going to be Clockwork Percussionist and Arabella. Arabella is a 1/3 legendary artifact creature that says whenever it attacks, it deals damage to each opponent, getting through hexproof, getting through protection, so it's even really good against the One Ring, where X is the number of creatures with power 2 or less that you control. I saw Young Dingo playing this card in Modern, and it really started to make me think. Everything at Convoke is really low to the ground, with the exception of the Knight Errant of Eos and the Venerated Loxodon. If you just play this, you deal a bunch of damage to your opponent, and you gain a bunch of life. That seems sick. And worst case scenario, you can always just hit it with a Gleeful demo and make a bunch of little tokens. Alright, this goes great with Warden of the Inner Sky since it's an artifact and a creature. And with Clockwork Percussionist, It's a creature with haste that's an artifact creature, and when it dies, you exile the top card of your library. Honestly, one of the things that I feel like Convoke needed was a little bit of extra like card advantage. You can play this, swing with it, and then second main, hit it with a Gleeful Demo, look at the extra card on top of your deck. Like, it does a lot. It slices and it dices. And then, let's say you make some copies of it with the Jolly Balloon Man. They're going to die on the end step. They're going to be sacrificed. You're getting that trigger regardless. That's pretty sweet. But, honestly, I think it's going to be good regardless. Until we start to look at some cards that kind of deal with these low to the ground aggro decks. But before we get into the horror that is looking at the cards that destroy low to the ground aggro, let's talk about the new cycle of Laylines that got printed. Now, most of them, Layline of Transformation, Layline of Mutation, not necessarily the greatest. Layline of Hope, a big stinker. The reprint of Layline of the Void, when there was already Layline of the Void that got printed into the extra page of stuff from Wilds of Eldraine. But the real heat here is Layline of Resonance. Just like all the other Laylines, if it's in your opening hand, you get to play it for free. This card is insane. People have been kind of worried about this card as it shows up in Standard because it's going to allow for turn 2 wins with Heartfire Hero and Monstrous Rage and Callous Sellsword, the Rakdos Prowess list of the Standard format. In Pioneer, it's got the potential to do the exact same thing. And in Pioneer, there are extra targets to deal with potentially multiple copies of Layline of Resonance. Now, Aspiring Spike talked about this in his video looking at Duskmourn for Modern, but this card paired with any of the Magecraft creatures and Illuminator Virtuoso is an absolute house. You take all your instants and sorceries that you're targeting your creatures with, you copy it instead of casting it again, so womp, Prowess wouldn't trigger, but Magecraft does. You immediately turn your Clever Lumimancer, even if it's not the target of one of the spells, into a 4/5 beat stick. Illuminator Virtuoso gets double the triggers, double the times that you tap it, or target it. That's huge. And especially with some of the new pump spells that we got out of the Duskmourn set, I think we actually have a really good thing going on here. One of the biggest ones is Jump Scare. Alright, a horrifying looking card with just absolutely delicious flavor text. But it gives your creatures +2/+2 and flying, and they become an enchantment creature in addition to their other types. Definitely a little iffy if we're looking at potentially Beseiju being a big player against these decks. But this seems like the quickest way to just throw your Illuminator Virtuoso out of harm's way. Double target, pump it up to potentially a like 7/7 double striking threat is huge. Basically turn like 3/14 damage, and that's before you start looking at the fact that you're definitely playing Heartfire Hero and Clever Lumimancer in this deck, and it's really big. I tested out a couple copies of this in my like Rakdos Aggro play testing with some of my teammates, and this card did kind of pop off. Turn 2 wins are possible, even through removal, which is a scary possibility, and definitely accounts for the reason why this is a $17 card. Illuminator Virtuoso gives you a way to get extra copies out of your hand, because really all you need is one. Multiples are just adding a lot of extra damage on top of everything. Alright, but let's talk about really some stuff that's coming after my own heart here. All right, I am a big Rakdos enjoyer, a big Rakdos mid-range lover. I've been a big fan of Shieldred ever since she got spoiled. I wasn't super sold on her until I really started reading into her, but she's a must answer threat. And in Duskmourn, we got Razorkin Needlehead, a 2 red pip version of Shieldred. It gets first strike, and whenever an opponent draws a card, you deal a damage to them. Throw those cards together, and it's a lightning bolt at your opponent's face every single time that they draw a card. With Phoenix and Treasure Cruise still being huge players in the format, a Treasure Cruise into either of these is an absolute beating. I think there is a build of Rakdos out there, a build of Rakdos mid-range in particular, that can not only run these, but it might also now run Furnace Punisher. We might be looking at a punishing version of Rakdos, one that deals damage to each player based on the fact that they might not be running a whole lot of basics. Now, would your particular version of Rakdos have to run a whole lot of like non-basics? Yeah, that's kind of the unfortunate caveat here. But you're also running Graveyard Trespasser, you're running Shieldred, heck, you might even just be running Ob Nixilis at that point. You're gonna have the ability to gain back a lot of life. You're not gonna be super worried about you taking that 2 damage when you land some of these other creatures on the board. And note that they all have something that your opponents have to deal with. First Strike, Menace, Death Touch. You throw in Graveyard Trespasser and it's got Ward. You throw in the Blood Tithe Harvester, you've got a removal spell on a body. You put in Liliana and Ob Nixilis and Bone Crusher Giant. The deck basically builds itself. A couple Thought Seizes and a couple Fatal Pushes, and this deck might actually be something that we can cook with. We might see a little bit of trouble into the aggro slanted format, but gaining all that life could help save us a lot. Now, here's the thing. FOMO is real. FOMO is very real. If you've been paying attention to Young Dingo and Aspiring Spike doing a lot of their modern play testing with Duskmourn, you've seen them talking about how Fear of Missing Out is the breakout card of this set. It's a 2-drop, 2/3 enchantment creature that when it enters, you discard a card and draw a card. On an empty board, or rather with an empty hand, this is straight up drawing you a card. But we're not trying to do that. Not in the shell that I think this belongs in. I think this belongs in a Greasefang shell. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, Mardu Greasefang's already a thing. And Mardu Greasefang's pretty solid. Well, Abzan's pretty solid. You got all the spells that help you fill your yard up. But there's one thing that Abzan does that Mardu might do better. And that's combat. Because Fear of Missing Out says, if you have 4 more card types in your yard, you untap this creature, and there's an additional combat phase. You can turn your Greasefang turns potentially into the most broken combat turns, where you just go turn 1 Stitcher Supplier, mill a bunch of cards, turn 2 Fear of Missing Out, put one of your big vehicles into the yard, and you can even throw a Seeka's Chariot in there at that point. In turn 3, Greasefang, reanimate one of your big vehicles, and then boom, swing, extra combat, and just absolutely devastate your opponents. There's a lot of potential here with this card, not only in a Greasefang shell, but in one that we'll see closer to the end of this presentation. Now, nobody's really been thinking about this deck in a while. This deck has fallen out of favor in Modern. It got some bannings in Pauper. But with Sheltered by Ghosts and the printing of Nowhere to Run, this might be Boggles' turn to come back. This might be its time. Sheltered by Ghosts does a really weird impression of Skyclave Apparition. And it also ends up kind of being like Daybreak Coronet. And it ends up giving your creature some protection. The card really slaps. Alright, it does everything. It is the Swiss Army knife of enchantments. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, Moss, there's not a Slippery Boggle in the format. You're right, there's not. But we've got the next best thing in the terms of Glade Cover Scout, which has hexproof. It's a 1-drop. And Toadstool Admirer. Now, you might be thinking back to like old builds of the Bant Boggles list in Pioneer. They were running Cyba Cryptomancer, the 2-drop blue like artifact creature out of Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. But Toadstool Admirer is a 1-drop with Ward 2. Play that on 1. Sheltered by Ghosts immediately turns it into a 1/2 creature with lifelink and Ward 4. You basically DIY your own version of Kappa Cannoneer that takes out a blocker from your opponent. Combine that with a reprint of Ethereal Armor in the set. It was already legal in Pioneer, but hey, reprints lower the prices of already super low staples. This card is huge. This deck has the potential to stand out now. It can still be banned, and it still should be banned, so you can get a lot of those protection spells, the things that allow you to phase out your creatures when removal comes through. Nowhere to Run is a card that not only kind of helps people deal with Boggles, but it also helps you deal with like opposing Boggles decks. Alright, Nowhere to Run, when it enters and it has Flash, it gives your opponent's creature -3/-3, and it says that the targets of spells can be targeted as if they didn't have hexproof, and ward abilities don't trigger. So yes, the deck is going to be allowed to exist, but it immediately gets hated out by this. But note that it's black. I don't think we're going to be seeing a whole lot of black-based decks running this at the RC. You might be able to sneak in some pretty good wins by just running 4 copies of this and 4 copies of these cards, and maybe a combination of SRAM and Light Paws. Because Nowhere to Run is good, but without Amalia being around, I don't think people are going to be thinking about hexproof as much. Without seeing a lot of the big vampire being thrown into play on turn 3, we're not going to be thinking a whole lot about ward. I think people are going to be overlooking a lot of the good ward creatures and a lot of the good hexproof creatures. This won't show up a lot. Boggles might have its time to shine while people are really kind of underrepresenting it in the format. But the big stinker, and again, this is me as a certified creature enjoyer. This is me as the Boros energy player in Modern. I hate Pyroclasm. Absolutely hate this card. Alright, 2 mana, it's a sorcery, deals 2 damage to each creature. Effectively, Prowess, Convoke, low to the ground aggro decks have to be wary of this card. Phoenix will be running it. Rakdos mid-range, even Rakdos aggro might be running it. You need to be aware of this card. For me, as a creature enjoyer, for many of you as creature enjoyers, this card is an absolute stinker. A lot of us are going to be used to seeing this screen on Arena the moment this card hits the battlefield, and we start just scooping it up immediately. But it is good. Phoenix is definitely going to be running it. Rakdos midrange is definitely going to be running it. We could even see like Rakdos Sacrifice running this, because Pyroclasm and really the original Meat Hook Massacre, just wiping a board of little guys, is already backbreaking. Alright, but the last deck that we're going to talk about is really a deck that at one time did terrorize the format, and it's one that I think is about to have its time again. So the way that Boggles and Greasefang used to be just enemies of the format, at one point Gruul Aggro used to be too. But now with the printing of stuff like Fear of Missing Out, with the printing of Wildfire Wickerfolk, I think we actually have a pretty solid core of just aggressive 1 and 2 drop creatures to bring this deck back from the grave. Now, Fear of Missing Out says when it enters, discard a card, draw a card. Again, empty handed, you're immediately drawing a card. If you have a handful of things, that's actually helping your Wildfire Wickerfolk out. Now, just in case you haven't read this card, it's a red-green artifact creature scarecrow with haste and delirium. As long as there are 4 or more types in your graveyard, it gets +1/+1 and trample. Now, as you can see here, Anax, it's an enchantment. Klothys, an enchantment. Fear of Missing Out, an enchantment. Alright, these are enchantment creatures. So already 2 types in the yard. Alright, artifact creature, 2 types in the yard. We can throw some excess lands. This is an aggro deck. It functions on 3 lands really well. You need no more than 4. Start dumping extra lands. Start dumping extra creatures. It's Gruul. You can run a Tarkus command. You can run burn spells. Play with fire. You can dump those in the yard. You've got the ability to hit Delirium really easily in this deck. Now, getting beyond that, sorcery's a little bit harder pressed. Planeswalkers, a little bit harder pressed. But there's a lot of potential here. Combine that with stuff like Gallia of the Endless Dance. If you have 1 card in hand and you attack with 3 or more creatures, you discard a card at random, draw 2 cards. It's pretty good. And let's say that you hit Delirium, not only would Wildfire Wickerfolk trigger, but so would the Fear of Missing Out. Additional combats, additional cards being drawn off of attacks, and lest we forget, those Gruul decks of old used to run Embercleave. It enters for however many creatures you attack with, it gets cheaper. It's not hard to get like 3 attacking creatures on turn 3. You can get this down to as little as just the 2 red super easily. Give your creatures double strike and trample super easily. Alright, Anax makes a bunch of 1/1 red satyr tokens whenever a non-token creature enters. Gallia pumps your satyrs, they all get haste. So if you get that extra combat and all your stuff starts dying, you're going to get a bunch of little guys that are going to keep swinging through for big damage. This deck really does just kind of feed into itself. And the fact that it can play removal helps it deal with a lot of the Rakdos aggro decks that are showing up. And you got Klothys to gain life. You're offsetting a lot of the problems that some decks in the format are showing you. This deck seems actually really sweet. But that's everything that I've got for you guys today. Like I said, don't forget to like and subscribe or rather, like this video, subscribe to the channel, do all that YouTuber stuff that you should be doing anyway. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about this list. Maybe there are some cards that I missed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, and hopefully I'll see you guys in DC. Peace.